Okay, it looks like people are getting ready. So, it's lunchtime. Can you believe how fast that's been going? And so we're going to get started. And David, our keynote speaker, is aware that you are eating while he talks, so it's okay. It's all good. It really is a pleasure to introduce you to our keynote speaker, NPR's media correspondent, David Folkenflik. I first met David when he and I were ethics fellows at the Poynter Institute in the mid-2000s. We haven't figured out what year that was, but we know Kelly was there, and we did have a good time, and it was pretty lively. So lively is why I'm glad David agreed to address the media ethics workshop this year. I make a lot of calls to people who might be speakers for us, and sometimes they hesitate, and sometimes I have to cajole them. And on the very first day I called David, it was like, hey, it's Jan. It's not like we talk all the time. Would you be interested? And he said, yeah, I want to do it. So I'm so glad that you're here. And I know that you'll be glad when you hear him. So David's bio is in your packet, in your program, and I'm just going to summarize a little bit about this. He's actually been criticized. You can read about what Geraldo said about him, and he's also been lauded frequently for his reporting and his commentary. He's actually based in New York City now. Oh, we heard about the New York, Washington people, so you can talk about that. Though I have to tell you something, he has 2 phone numbers in 2 different area codes. I don't know how that works. His stories and analyses are broadcast on All Things Considered, Morning Edition, and Here and Now, and are featured on NPR's website and all of its mobile platforms. David covers people who shape journalism, so he's the media correspondent, so he's interested in what media do. And all the shifts in the media industry. He's been interviewed, as you probably know, on many high-profile shows, and was a very prominent figure in the new Netflix documentary, Nobody Speak. I am a huge fan of this documentary. He and I have talked about this a couple of times. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I really recommend it. Recently, David's been doing reports on the Seth Rich case, Breitbart under Bannon again, Vanity Fair's editor retiring, Snopes fact-checking, I love that one, and many, many more. So David is the author of Murdoch's World, the last of the old media empires. The Los Angeles Times called that book meaty reading laced with delicious anecdotes. He's also, I know, right? We're talking about food, right? Folkenflik is also the editor of Page One, Inside the New York Times and the Future of Journalism. I don't know where he has time to do all this. His work has appeared in many, many publications like the Washington Post and Politico, and he has been called one of the 50 most influential people in American media. So I'm so happy to know you. I feel like I know a celebrity. David joined NPR in 2004 after more than a decade at the Baltimore Sun. He started his professional career at the Durham, North Carolina Herald-Sun. He is the son of 2 college professors, so I know he's comfortable here at college. He graduated from Cornell, and he grew up in California. After David's address, Kelly will begin a discussion and will field your questions. So please give a very warm Kent State welcome to David Folkenflik.
I just want to thank Jan Leach for that ridiculous introduction and also for arranging this wonderful event. So for Jan, please, if we can. I'd like to thank also Dean Reynolds for hosting this event, Kelly McBride, Indira, and others at the Poynter Institute for sustaining this tremendous forum for people to think about things and take a moment and think about them hard. It's a little, one thing Jan mentioned to me was she said a lot of the questions are coming from people who are professionals and academics today. I want to stress how much I want to hear from them, but also from students here. And I want to thank both the educators, the professionals, the students who came here on a lovely fall day, and those students forced to be here today, dragged, kicking, and screaming. I'm particularly grateful for you. I've got to earn your attention and your trust during this talk. So thank you for being here as well. I will probably not talk that long, because I'm interested in Kelly's questions always, and yours equally. So let's be mindful of that. In fact, I will set myself a little timer, even as we speak. not fake news. And away we go. So in thinking, the lab mic works all right? In thinking about fake news and its strengths and flaws as a label, and about how we think about this, I think about what texts we can trust, what sources we turn to for inspiration, for guidance, and for a solid foundation of fact. So naturally, I turn to one of the more important sources of unimpeachable information. I turn to Dr. Seuss. I've got girls who are 5 and 2, pretty big source of information in my home at night anyway. I'm turning to a lesser known text called Sneetches. And it is a parable of sorts. I will not read the whole thing, I do promise. But it starts out this way. Now, the star-bellied Sneetches had bellies with stars. The plain-bellied Sneetches had none upon theirs. Those stars weren't so big. They were really so small. You might think such a thing wouldn't matter at all. But because they had stars, all the star-bellied Sneetches would brag we're the best kind of Sneetch on the beaches. With their snoots in the air, they would sniff and they'd snort. We'll have nothing to do with the plain-bellied sort. And whenever they met some, when they were out walking, they'd hike on right past them without even talking. When the star-bellied children went out to play ball, could a plain belly get in the game? Not at all. You could only play if your belly had stars, and the plain-bellied children had none upon theirs. So this is a story and a parable written in, I believe, 1961 about racial equality and inclusion in the sense of exclusivity in society. And it ultimately reaches a place where people realize their distinctions matter a lot less than their common humanity or sneechanity. I'm not sure. We can work on that and get there. What interests me in thinking about it for this event, however, is a gentleman comes to town. A gentleman comes to town in the strangest of cars, and he offers them something that will be of value to them. He says, "My friends, my name is Sylvester McMonkey McBean. I've heard of your troubles. I've heard you're unhappy, but I can fix that. I'm the fix-it-up chappie. I've come here to help you. I have what you need. My prices are low, and I work at great speed, and my work is 100% guaranteed." Sylvester McMonkey McBean. And what does he do? He creates this contraption that takes stars and places them onto the belly of theirs that don't have them. And suddenly everyone has a star, and people wander around, Sneetches I should say, walk around confused because they're not sure if their belly should have a star upon theirs or not. And suddenly there is a blurring and there's a blending, but the ones who had them originally are offended because they realize they were the original Sneetches. They are the ones with the stars on their bellies. So he comes to them and says, I have a solution for you too, folks. Things are not quite as bad as you think, so you don't know who's who. That's perfectly true, but come with me, friends. Do you know what I'll do? I'll make you again the best Sneetches on beaches, and all it will cost you is $10 eaches. And he puts them to another contraption, and it takes the stars off the bellies. So suddenly the ones that had stars upon theirs no longer have stars upon theirs, and they are the other Sneetches. Well, this causes a little bit of concern and confusion, as you can see. And what does he end up doing? He ends up creating two contraptions that are flowing simultaneously. And they are putting people, Sneetches, not people, Sneetches, through the ones that have stars, get them off, and then they march right around the corner and go through the one that puts them back on, and suddenly society is on an infinity loop, if you will, a Mobius strip of figuring out who has stars and who doesn't have stars, and it goes until all of the things that are theirs, which is to say all of their money, is with Sylvester McMonkey McBean. So he gets what he wants out of it, and he goes off into the distance. Now, I can tell you the story has actually a very happy end, and it is the right lesson, and it is the right direction for all of this. But there are two fascinating lessons that I take from this, having read this a number of times in the last couple years, that are relevant to what we're doing. And one of it is to think very hard about whether, in fact, you're the product being sold. Because the thing going through those conveyor belts were the Sneetches. They weren't anything else. They were the product being shipped and manipulated, and they were paying for the privilege of it. And the second thing is that disinformation sows and creates discord. And that was a society that was in complete tumult as a result of a guy who came to town offering a solution to a problem which probably wasn't a problem. And I think in what we're talking about today, the experts, the people, I gotta say, who know about 17 times more than I do about this question, which means that since I left for about half, you guys know about 8.5% more than I do about this topic. you know, that you get a feel for what the repercussions are of this. It's not just funny, it's not just interesting, it's not simply harmless, although not all of it is as toxic or as problematic as people say, but it is warping our understanding of our world around us. Why do I even cover media? I mean, people are like, oh, that's kind of self-absorbed of you, and sure, I'm a pretty self-absorbed guy, so there's some truth in that. But there's also the sense that the media, what we think of as mainstream media or establishment media, conventional media, is the prism through which we understand the society around us. And the people who are already here today probably already get that. People who aren't so interested may not. But you know, take a moment, think about it consciously. It's how we understand the world around us. Then there's a layer of social media and unconventional media and you know, dark media, you know, the ways that are not monitored, in which people are also themselves involved in the creation of content, creation of material, and creating their own prisms through which others are understanding the world around us. But it matters because it gives us a sense of who we are. I mean, I always try to remember, I try not to talk about this on the air too much, but I do every now and then acknowledge the whole point of the media, if we're doing it right in terms of journalism, is we are not simply equipping people as consumers. We are treating them as citizens and not dictating to them what they do with their information, but giving them enough understanding, enough raw material, but also enough context to make informed decisions about how they want their societies to operate. And it's harder to do that if you're being bathed in craptacular material. And that's a technical term. It'll be a glossary later on. So, you know, we've had some excellent definitions, better than I would offer you, about what fake news is. You know, there's flawed reporting. There's stuff that is pretty good but not quite there, and every mistake tends to undermine your faith in what you see. When I worked at the Durham Herald-Sun, they said if you get a middle name wrong in Durham, people are going to know it because they know each other. They've lived here a long time, most folks, and they read the paper really closely. And when I went on to the Baltimore Sun, where I was fortunate enough to work for a decade, I got the middle name of a woman wrong. She was a trustee in a local Catholic school. She was also the architect who designed Camden Yards. And man, if a hammer didn't come down on my head that day. You know, I got it wrong, and it mattered to people because it's like a little bit of water on the bond, dripping on a bond that connects you to your reader, to the people you're writing about, to your communities. There's parody. There's this site that came up, it's not so prevalent now, but used to come up called the Daily Current. It's spelled like a raisin, C-U-R-A-N-T. And it was like The Onion if the men and women of The Onion weren't that funny. And you might say to yourself, why would you do that? Well, if The Onion is that funny, it'll get clicks. The Onion's often hilarious, but it takes really hard work. The Daily Current has this sort of masterstroke of insight, which is that if you're not that funny, people will click on it because they actually kind of believe it, or they want to believe it. And so that'll drive a lot of hits, and that's a financial model more than a political endeavor. You get misinformation, you get disinformation, and that takes you to misinformation takes you to places that have been talked about but should be talked about. Places that unexpectedly have served as resources and sources for some people currently in government, including at times the President of the United States. But you get a guy like Mike Cernovich, who has developed this following online, over the course of the past couple years, has explored possibilities and theories and stirrings of possible stories that it ends up being the question of, you know, is there a pedophilia ring being run out of a pizza joint in Northwest Washington with ties to senior Democrats? And it turned out no. Actually, there was no truth to anything like that, but they looked at little words and strange emails found in the big WikiLeaks dump that occurred in 2016 during the campaign, and people assigned meaning to it, and once accepting that those words had meanings, which they apparently had none of, they then assigned implications to those meanings, then they assigned essentially conclusions to the implications, to the meanings, none of which was grounded on anything, and a guy drives up from North Carolina with a rifle and shoots up the pizza place. Now, nobody was hurt by the grace of God and good fortune, but that's a real-world consequence of misinformation that was really involved, or seemed to be motivated by the desire to stir up mistrust of the Clinton campaign, mistrust of what the media would or wouldn't cover. And by raising these questions, as you often hear our friends on cable news put it, they essentially allowed the virus to get into the more national bloodstream of the media. And we heard earlier about Macron in France from our friend Mandy at Storyful, and why this fake news didn't catch. And I don't think there's the amplifying effect there, the tradition of that there with online news sites that are taken seriously by sort of major institutional media outlets there. And you don't have, to the same degree, the practice and the tradition of cable news, essentially serving as a legitimizing amplifier of things that are in the ether. And we can talk about that a bit more. But those are ways that do that. Fake news is not new, and I think this point's been made several times. I think Indira said this, but it's not new. If you think back to, I believe it was the 2000 campaign, might have been 2004, George W. Bush is photographed a certain way during a debate. It's a little bit from behind, and has got the boxy jacket, whatever, and there's a little thing that looks like a square between the shoulder blades. And suddenly people were saying, oh my God, what they're doing is they've got this earpiece in him, they're feeding him the answers, he must be a moron, he can't answer things during a live debate, and that's what that is, it's a little box with it. There's no truth to this whatsoever. The New York Times actually wrote a story about it. Now, people were talking about it to the extent that perhaps major news organizations need to address and debunk that. And they said, they essentially landed on the place, so this seems highly unlikely. But that's the fact that that was broached and treated in a serious way was driven by partisans on left-wing sites and other places that wanted to believe the worst of Bush. John Kerry, 2004, the Swift boat things. There may be some people who remember that. There may be some people who have no memory of it. That's all right. He was essentially accused during his time in Vietnam, and he went as a guy who was at Yale and went to Vietnam. He did not necessarily have to do that in that way. And that was a courageous move that a lot of young men at the time sought very hard not to have to make. He went to Vietnam. He was accused by people, including some former Vietnam vet, who disagreed with him on his position on other things when he was running for president. He was accused of being a war criminal, and he was accused of being a coward. And this got exceptional coverage. And one of the last stories I did at the Baltimore Sun before I joined NPR in the fall of 2004 was a story based on an interview with the young Washington bureau chief of Sinclair Broadcasting, which is currently about to grow significantly with the acquisition of many dozens of news stations. And they were going to put on an hour-long special based on this thing that had been percolating up. It had been percolating up through conservative sites. It had been percolating up in talk radio. It had started to hit Fox pretty hard. And the idea was he was a coward, he was a war criminal. Nightline sent a young producer named Andrew Morse, and they took him on this little boat, and without the permission of the Vietnamese authorities, he essentially goes up the Mekong Delta, and he finds the village where this firefight occurs, in which, among other things, John Kerry is accused of shooting like a 12-year-old boy in the back, a war crime. And he interviews the people at the village. And these are people who don't have televisions. They have no idea who John Kerry is. They have no idea that America has a presidential election whatsoever. And he goes and painstakingly with colleagues interviews people there. And they remember that fight. That was an epic moment in the history of that village. And there's a little plaque or monument of some sort there, if I'm remembering it quite correctly. And John Kerry didn't do that. They remembered this tall guy who was basically John Kerry as among these guys on this Swift boat at that time. And it didn't happen. And real reporting didn't really trump, shall we say, fake news, this thing that was put out there. But it got on the record the necessary facts that kind of bled that out as an issue, and it tamped down. I think it did affect how some people looked at Kerry. It was baked in because the mainstream media took a long time to get there and to think that this was a story worth addressing. And after a certain point, people assumed it was true. But that was, whatever you think about John Kerry, who should win, who should lose. If I recall, I think Ohio was a place where the votes were very close at the time. That was a shameful thing to do to a guy. And it takes good journalism to follow bad journalism to follow fake news, I guess we would now call it. The question of fake news and its use, of course, is itself now a label. And it's a brilliant, give Donald Trump a lot of credit. Labeling things that are either mistaken or more often unwelcome scrutiny as fake news is just a great jujitsu move rhetorically. Not so good in the truth sector, but a great move rhetorically, because it's essentially saying, this is fake, you can't trust this, you don't even need to look at it further. And it forces news organizations back on their heels to defend themselves and to spend a lot of time explaining perhaps how they came by that, what they were doing, to figure out the extent to which they want to debate and engage in a debate about their own legitimacy when it distracts from their ability to actually report on what's actually happening and frame the news agenda for themselves. It's not an admirable thing to do to your citizens in terms of helping them understand the world around them, but it's real. So I did a story about Fox News' coverage of Seth Rich in early August. And I based it in part on material that was gathered to file a lawsuit against Fox News and some of the players in it. And indeed, that was the story. One of the things I wanted to do was not simply take the lawsuit at its word, so I was able to go out and spend a day or two doing my best to talk to people who were cited, whose actions were described, characterized part of that lawsuit, and figure out how truthful was it. I mean, you don't always get the chance to do that before something's filed, but I was like, let me go and report and find out more than simply what's represented in the lawsuit itself. So I talked to one of the major defendants and figures in it, who was a behind-the-scenes source. I listened and reviewed to a lot of audio tapes that had been taken, and I was able to review a lot of email exchanges back and forth and confirm with people that they had been involved in emails or conversations of the kinds that were described. I also was able to talk to Sean Spicer. Now, this is a nutty story. Let's take a moment. The Seth Rich story, if you've heard about it from us or others, forgive me, he's killed in mid-July 2016. He's 27, young guy working for the Democratic National Committee, which is the party, effectively. He's shot and dies a couple hours later in the early morning hours of this evening after being out with friends for drinks. And there is, soon after, the conspiracy floated. The idea is raised about whether his death has to do with the leak of emails from Democratic Party officials to one another and to other figures involved in Hillary Clinton's campaign that are embarrassing to the Clinton campaign, to the Democrats, and that throw them all off stride. This is something that the Clintons basically had to deal with. As there was an early leak, I think, in the spring, and then there was another big one in the summer, and these things really were chaos creators. And US intelligence chiefs now have concluded that that happened by hackers working at the behest of the Russian government, hoping both to disrupt the campaign and to help Trump. People in, the head of WikiLeaks sort of raises the prospect that it's possible that Seth Rich gave his life to help get out information, although he doesn't say so conclusively. But there appears to have been no credible evidence brought forward that there was this link. On May 16th, Fox News posts a story online and then does a lot of news coverage subsequent that says, actually, there's law enforcement sources that say there is evidence on Seth Rich's laptop. It was, this evidence was seen during an FBI forensics report. And they quote a guy who's a private detective working on behalf of the Riches saying, yeah, that's right. Just for a quick moment, that guy then sues Fox, saying, you put those words in my mouth. I never said that. And there's, in fact, audio tape of him and the Fox reporter talking in which he acknowledges that. Now, he said some things that seem to indicate he believes in the conspiracy theories, but not that he had proof of it. I talked to Sean Spicer. Why did I talk to Sean Spicer? Well, at that point, in late July, early August, he's easing out of his role at the White House. But he had had a meeting in April at the White House with the private investigator looking into all this, and with this guy working behind the scenes to make the Fox story happen. He had been the one to pick the private investigator and to tell him we're going to be able to show there was a link between Seth Rich and these email leaks. He was the one who essentially was giving not only tips, but giving storylines to the reporter involved. And this seems fairly well documented. And Sean Spicer takes the meeting at the White House to talk about the findings of the Seth Rich case. This is a really weird thing. I just want to underscore that. This is very bizarre. Spicer tells me, you know, I took the meeting as a courtesy. Ed Butowski, who's the guy who'd been working behind the scenes, is a guy who, where is this? Yeah, this is the kind of conspiracist thing that comes up. Ed Butowski is this Dallas investor who supports Trump. He's a Fox commentator for many years. He's been a Republican surrogate, which is what they call people who go out and take talking points on cable news. He's taken the meeting because Butowski has been a very helpful voice over the years helping the Republican Party. He did nothing with it. He didn't know what to do with it. It's a homicide, unclear homicide. White House doesn't get involved with this. Butowski's future emails say things like, the White House is aware of the story we're developing with you and Fox, and they want us to get on it. He then says Trump is aware of it. He's seen the story and he wants it to run. It's time to go. And there's a consistent pressure on the private eye to say the things that the reporter, and particularly this guy working behind the scenes, wants said, at least as presented in the material in the lawsuit and seemingly substantiated by some of the records there. And it's a drumbeat, and it builds up, and they do the story, and it all explodes and collapses, and they have to retract it. Spicer says, I take it as a courtesy, and yet it appears from the contemporaneous emails that there seems to be some awareness of the White House. I call Spicer, I relay his version of it. I don't actually know at this time, I can say, the degree to which others at the White House were informed by Spicer of what happened, whether he went into Steve Bannon, whether he went into Reince Priebus after this April meeting, whether he went into the president himself. It would seem an almost impossible idea that the president of the Oval Office would learn of this information, particularly from such a tendentious source. And yet, this White House has relied on material, and this president has tweeted out material, as we heard earlier from Greg, from sources that are not conventional and kind of dubious in nature. And in fact, that come from sources that are discredited. And so we don't know what happened. And I was careful in this story not to present it that way. But I asked Sean what he said. He talked to me on the record. Fine. Next day, I'm asked to go on CNN to talk about this, as well as pursuing the story further. In the hallways at CNN, I get a call. I say, OK. I don't recognize the number. I say, OK. He says, hi, it's Sean. And I'm just in the moment, and I am not thinking. I said, Sean? Question mark. He said, it's Sean Spicer. I said, OK. I said, how you doing today? He's like, well, I'd be doing a lot better if you hadn't failed in your reporting this morning. I said, tell me what happened. And he said, well, you reported that I'm getting sued over this Seth Rich story, and I'm not. I said, I did not say that. He said, well, you did. He said, I said, I really didn't. He said, well, then why am I getting questions from the Washington Post and CNN, reporters from them, asking me why I'm being sued? I said, maybe because they didn't listen to my story that closely. I said, I don't know. I can't be responsible for that. I can be responsible for what I did, and I promise you. My suit doesn't say that. My story doesn't say that because it's not true. He didn't say it. He said, well, then your story failed because you didn't make that clear. I said, I say who the defendants are. Please listen and read to the story. I'm so sorry that you're in the middle of this. He said, well, you didn't make clear the extent to which this was part of a lawsuit. And I said, the lawsuit wasn't filed yet. I said, I'm more interested in the fact pattern of what happened with this story. I cover the media. I'm trying to understand how Fox operates and the ways in which it has influences than I am necessarily in the legal merits of the case. I'm interested in the factual merits of what's being presented here. Although the lawsuit, obviously, it's important to report on. And this week, Fox responded, and I reported on that as well. And he said, well, that's ridiculous. He's like, you know what I'm going to do? You're fake news. Literally, it's like he's thinking, he clicks, Gary clicks, he says, you're fake news. I'm going to go out there and I'm going to blast you as fake news. And I said, Seth, everything in my story was documented, attributed, and on the record. I said, I had no on-the-record comments in this story, not one. I was like, all of it's on the record. What's fake about it? He said, well, I'm going to blast you. And I said, good luck to you. I said, you do that if you feel it's necessary to do that, but I'm not sure on what basis you think you're going to do that. And he's like, fine. I said, Sean, I'm happy to talk about this further. I'd like to talk about this further. I've got to go do this thing. And he just hung up the phone on me, and that's his right. That's fine. But it was as though his mind was clicking to a gear and finally shifted into one that was comfortable to him. I'm going to attack you as fake news. And why is he going to do that? Because he's going to want to attack and assail the idea that the White House had any involvement in this story or that this story has any purchase. Interesting to me was Sarah Huckabee Sanders at the White House lectern was asked about this story within 24, 48 hours. And she said, listen, the press secretary meets with reporters all the time. And, you know, the nature of their stories, whatever they are. But, you know, that doesn't mean that we've done anything. And it's true. It doesn't mean that Spicer or the White House did anything with this story or helped to propel this story in the way the lawsuit alleges may have occurred. But it was interesting that she talked about these people as reporters. You had a guy who's a former homicide detective working as a private eye, hired on by a Trump supporter who, behind the scenes, has on tape making it very clear he wants to tie Seth Rich, this young Democrat, to the Democratic email leaks because it will take the heat off Trump for his concerns about his connections with the Russians. This is very explicit. So you've got a Dallas investor who's a Trump supporter, and you've got a private eye, and Sarah Huckabee Sanders says, well, you know, what are you going to do? These guys are reporters. People talk to reporters all the time. These guys aren't reporters. What they were one was a longtime paid commentator for Fox News, the private eye. He talked about law enforcement issues like you know, the issues with police in Baltimore during the Freddie Gray riots. And he had Ed Butowski, this guy who was an unpaid but long-term Fox contributor, who commented on financial matters. And the reason I feel comfortable calling him that, even though he didn't have a contract with Fox, is that there was a page on Fox that said Ed Butowski, contributor, and they listed all of these essays he had written online and these appearances he had done. They removed that page once I pointed that out to them. But so you had Fox introducing into the bloodstream something that gave credence to these feverish conspiracy theories for which there has been no evidence presented. I don't know, and the police don't know, and I don't know who killed, or at least police say they don't know, and I certainly don't know who killed Seth Rich, and I don't know the motive, although they say it looks very likely it was a botched robbery, and there were a number of armed robberies in that area in the preceding months. But what I can tell you is that much like the way in which Trump labels things fake news, Fox gives credence, and during its opinion hours gives a lot of weight to things about which they say, we're just asking questions, folks. But they're not willing to give you an understanding of how they come by those questions. One of the incredible problems with that story, of which there were many, was the lack of transparency about the involvement of Ed Butowski, who's really the animal spirit behind the story, if you will, and about the fact that there were people with ties to Fox arranging coverage by Fox and basing it on information that didn't really come from the sources they said it did. So if you think about the accusation of fake news that is applied often to the rest of the mainstream media by Fox, this is an example in which certainly there would seem to be more legitimacy than in most cases of calling this an instance of fake news. That this was a non-organic piece of news that was created to fulfill a pre-existing narrative, pre-existing beliefs. And I think that's a kind of jujitsu of its own by Fox that has redounded against them, and people haven't tended to hold them responsible for it because Fox is not, there's a wink involved with Fox where they basically are saying, we really are in the opinion business. We do have reporters, some of them hardworking and very honorable people who work for us. And that's a complicated thing for Fox when it's in the middle of a controversy like this. So when I think about fake news, I think of it as a problem for us as citizens. I think of it as a label that's applied to get rid of inconvenient coverage. I think of it as the kind of thing that the Russians not only have engendered with, if you believe the intelligence chiefs, by getting this information out, but also are actively involved in propagating through sites like, and outlets like RT and Sputnik. Sputnik is online, RT is TV, and they have the trappings of what look like American outlets, but are actually very involved not only in picking stories that feed the interests of the Russians in sowing certain pro-Russian or anti-their-opponent storylines, but also serve to just confuse, serve to muddy the waters, serve to create chaff. There was a guy who ultimately was their White House bureau chief for a time. He had worked for sort of smaller conventional outlets in Washington, but needed a job and took one with Sputnik. And he was reined in, yanked back, as he started to ask questions about the Trump administration, about why it wasn't doing things in Ukraine that it had promised to do in result of the Russians basically exerting too much influence and sending forces in there. Stories that Russians didn't want to have discussed, they wanted to pull back, and that's okay in a certain sense, but it's only okay if the information they put out is accurate. And over time, he became convinced that it wasn't, and that it was essentially a propaganda thing. And it's not simply that the information is wrong, it's that it confuses you as to what to trust, which reminds me a little bit of what we saw in this. Now, in this, you go through the sort of Mobius strip of it's unclear on who people are. In this, the end of this story, it's actually kind of awesome because they decide it doesn't matter who has stars and who doesn't have stars. It matters of the commonalities, and the people, Sneetches that had stars at the end were appreciated, and Sneetches that didn't have stars at the end were appreciated for being who they were, and that was great. For me, I think there's a slightly different concluding point or thinking about this. It's like if we want to be citizens, we have to work hard at figuring out who we can trust and what sources we can trust. We have to do more of, in some ways, interrogating the information we're given. I don't know if you mentioned this, but as we rode back from the airport yesterday, I shared an anecdote involving the prescience of Carl Sagan, the late Cornell professor, about predicting some of the issues we're grappling with now. And he says, "Are you sure Carl Sagan really said that?" And I said, "Well," I know his writing, and it seemed very consistent with it, but to be fair, I haven't interrogated that source of information." And Maso said, "Look, I didn't say it on the air. I didn't share it with Twitter. I haven't spoken about it in front of the crowd." And he's like, "But you told me." It's like, yeah, good point. And so I looked it up, and he did actually say it, folks. So I want to say you can occasionally trust me as being real news. It's worth occasionally, we have to be more aerobic to be citizens and not just consumers. And we have to remember that even in the non-cynical press, you are, in a sense, the product. I realized that in Baltimore when I started to cover media, and I was like, wait, so this newspaper actually gets a lot less of its revenue from subscriptions than it does from advertisers. That's really changed a lot. But at the time, if 80% of your money's coming in from advertisers, they're your clients. What's your product? It's not the newspaper. The newspaper is what draws you to the eyeballs of who the product are, which is the readers. You're trying to get readers to advertisers. So the readers are the product. Well, the Daily Current, the readers are the clickers. Facebook just wants to have you all day. And they don't want to take down a lot of stuff that draws you in, even if there are problems with it. And that's why they might do, for years, although they're starting really to make great strides, and at Google as well, in how they treat things. For years, the Denver Guardian, which is essentially a phony news site, looked just the same as the Guardian of London, which is a very respected, slightly left of center publication. These are not equivalent sites, but they look the same, and they both have the word Guardian, and so you think, it's about the same, right? Because that's the visual cue. And I think that we as consumers have to be really more aerobic if we're going to function at all as citizens. And I think that news organizations have to interrogate their information. And I think that platforms that say, hey, we just put it out there, folks, it's not us, are going to really have to take some responsibility. And they are haltingly, sort of trippingly, as they don't want to discourage us from squandering our days and hours on these things. But they're going to have to take a lot more responsibility for what they put out there as well. So with that, I'm going to thank you. I'm going to thank the Sneetches, and I'm going to want to hear a lot of questions. First, starting with the great Kelly McBride. Let's sit down, by all means.
Sit down. You need your water?
I do. Thank you.
All right. So, I want to start with this question. You mentioned why you cover media.
Sure.
Right? Like, media is essentially a form of the air that we breathe as we are citizens, and it's important to know how well it's doing. We are not these people. That could be, that's fake news. Bless you. But just like there are a lot more brokers of opinion these days, there are exponentially more people doing media coverage and analysis now in 2017 than there were in 2004 when you moved from the Baltimore Sun.
It's horrible. They're all doing my job.
They are. And I notice this because every time the media does screw up, there's a lot of attention paid to the screw-ups. We talk a lot about media these days. It's a cottage industry. What impact does that have on our understanding of fake news?
You guys can hear all right down here? I think it's more of a McMansion industry than a cottage industry. I think it's actually pretty significant. You see over at CNN, they built up a stable of media reporters. They do, as well as their on-the-air stuff, they do online things, they do nightly newsletters, they cover a ton of stuff, they're expanding it. NBC News just announced it's hired woman from the New York Post to be the editor. She's covered media for some time. They hired Jim Rainey, who laid a Variety in the LA Times, and they're having a number of people from Recode, the tech site, contribute to that. And Mike Oreskes, if you're out there, buddy, and you're watching, we could use some money in our desk, if you know what I mean. There are a lot of people covering things, and it's gone from a side issue, particularly during presidential campaigns, to part of the main course. And I think that it's, sometimes I think too much, but it's hard also. You have a president who, as a candidate, had virtually 100% approval rating, or not approval rating, forgive me, 100% recognition, name recognition, by virtue of the fact not that he was a real estate operator, but that he had been a character and personality, first in the New York tabloid press and then elsewhere, and then as a reality show star. So you have a media presidency from the outset. It's not just that like JFK or like Reagan or like Obama, these are figures that the media captures flatteringly and know how to sort of intuitively at times work the right chords to be in sync with a story that might be flowing. It's rather that you've got a guy that is of the media. These are the waters he swims in every day. And so it's impossible not to consider how the media works, how it's changing, how it's absorbing him, how he's affecting them, and the new players that he's drawn in as a result. And it's both an overlap of popular culture and news, and it's also the mainstreaming to a degree of sites that would have been called fringe 2 years ago.
Yeah, and so, but it's also noisy.
It's really noisy, sure.
It's really noisy to try and, I feel like if you're an average citizen and you're trying to figure out exactly what is the state of the media, that you would, even though there's more people covering it, it would be harder to figure it out.
Yeah, fair. I mean, it's a reflection of how the media is at large. I mean, you can read instantaneously. This is not news in 2017, but you can instantaneously read things from all over the world. And you can, I can find sports scores in California, where I'm from, instantly, in real time. And the great advance is that you have all this incredible information coming at you. And the great problem is you have all of this information coming at you. And it's bewildering, and it's too much. And the usefulness of a place like Twitter is that sometimes it provides a logic and a way to order it, and to get information that's useful, but not all of the information. But that can be its own distraction and distortion. It's very hard to make sense of it. I think the best folks who deal with media are not trying to cover everything that's happening, and are not obsessing about the celebrity quotient of it.
Name a few that you like, other than yourself.
Folkenflick is dazzling. I mean, I don't know how you get past that. There are a lot of people who do smart things in different ways, and there are academics who contribute. I
actually think Stelter's newsletter is pretty good.
I think Brian Stelter does a valuable service, and I think he's working hard, and I think he does really nice breakdowns. Brian Stelter, is now on CNN. I met him as a 19-year-old sophomore at Towson University in Maryland. I lived, about 8 blocks away from where his dorms were, because I lived in Towson at the time. And he had been an anonymous blogger writing something called Cable Newser, or
TV Newser.
No, I think it started as Cable Newser, if I'm not mistaken, and then he expanded. And one of the things he was great at, particularly before we knew who he was, so it was just really impressive, was that he would break down minute by minute the different ways in which the cable channels would cover events that were unfolding. He'd do a little analysis. Okay, 11:17 this happened, 11:18 this is how MSNBC did, but Fox did it this other way, and CNN had this other guy, and he was offering you kind of this comparison that was its own form of media criticism, even if he wasn't saying this is good and here's why and this is bad. He was helping dissect it. It was really valuable. Well, if you watch his show, one of the things I like best is when he actually breaks down things in video and shows you the evolution of talking points or things like that. That's a real form of news literacy. That's a form of dissection that I think is very helpful. And the nightly newsletter is a roundup of all kinds of stuff. And like the great, like people online who really know how to do this well. Josh Marshall does this at Talking Points Memo. Jim Romanesco used to do this for Poynter. Is that he can find something off in the second to last paragraph and say, this is the most interesting thing, or this is the newsy development, and pull it up for you, and that's a great value. you know, I find there are times where you read the Free Beacon or the Weekly Standard, and they go into choices on framing of stories or news coverage. And I try to be pretty broad in where I get stuff, because I think it's pretty valuable. But you know, there's a gentleman who spoke here, I guess, a year or two ago, Jay Rosen. There are some journalists who look askance at him. He's really worked, I think, all of 3 months in a newsroom, but that's okay. I think information gets to come from all kinds of sources, and that critiques get to come from sources. Then you get to figure out how smart are they. I disagreed with a lot of things he said over the years, and yet some of his critiques are really savvy and really smart, and I think that can be a real service. So.
Okay, I'm going to ask you
Yeah,
one more question, and then I want to turn to the audience. So you wrote the book on Murdoch, and you are a particular authority on Fox News. You've done a really thorough job documenting how bad Fox's reporting was on the Seth Rich story. How do we characterize Fox overall?
I mean, Fox, one of the great myths is that Fox is not part of the mainstream media. Fox is a player in the mainstream media. You know, it reports on the news, it influences coverage, it influences, you know, the White House reaction to things, both under Democrats and Republicans, and they do news, the things that you do in a newsroom. That is not the point of Fox News. I mean, look, most of these places are built to make money, but Fox News is built to both make money and to create a place for the promotion of a certain kind of point of view and a voice. And what it's ended up being is playing an absolutely unmatched role in the Republican Party for which there's no parallel in either the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And so it's a hybrid beast. I mean, it's very much the opinion tail wagging the news dog. You know, what they care about are the program, you know, and what you see Trump tweet mostly about. You don't see him tweeting a whole lot about Shep Smith. He tweets about his buddies on Fox and Friends, sometimes the Five, and their primetime lineup. You know, he is, and look, you know, President Trump is, I think he's 70 years old now. You know, he is right there where the Fox viewer average is. You know, white guy about 70 years old, that's roughly their core viewer. It is a political outfit, even as it has journalism occurring at it, and that's a dissonance that's hard for people to unpack, and one to which many folks there take great offense, because there are people there who work hard, and there's sometimes some good coverage, sometimes a good, you know, Megyn Kelly did good job at that first debate in August of 2015 for the Republican primary field, and by the way, so did Brett Baer and Chris Wallace. They did a good job. Like, they did a good journalistic job at that, and that was driven in part by Roger Ailes saying, let's not go easy on folks. You know, so good journalistic things can emerge from there. Tucker Carlson, who's very Trump-friendly, I mean, he's kind of brilliant at it in the sense that he's really anti-Trump. And that's how you navigate the Trump world. It's much easier to fight a tough offense. So it's easier for MSNBC to flourish in an age where liberals think there's outrage occurring under a Republican president. And it's much easier. Fox does better, did great. When Obama was elected in November 2008, it was a funereal moment inside the newsroom, and you saw it on the air. You know, like Murdoch went home early, like they were all, you know, really annoyed. But it was great for Fox News's ratings. They got Glenn Beck on board. They doubled down. They said, we're the voice of the opposition. Literally, Bill Shine, former president, said, does this make this easy to be for us to be the voice of the opposition? Yes, it does. And so they did it. And that's when they were in their sweet spot. Clinton impeachment was when they found their voice. This is when they were in the sweet spot. And so Fox is, you know, MSNBC is a business model. It's a pure business play. You know, they got rid of Phil Donahue for opposing the war in Iraq, and this is many leaders ago there, but they nonetheless did that because they were uncomfortable with what they saw might be the blowback for against a anti-war stance of Donahue. Donahue had excellent ratings at that point for MSNBC. They got rid of that. They then sort of stumbled into a liberal model by realizing Keith Olbermann was onto something as Bush declined in popularity after Katrina, after the wars clearly had not gone great in Afghanistan and Iraq, after there's some other things going on as well. Olbermann did that, brought along Maddow, brought along Chris Hayes, and suddenly at a time when people are not unreasonably at times, concerned about certain issues involving Trump administration, you see an incredible spike in MSNBC, but that's a pure business play.
All right, questions? Here, right here in the middle.
Can each of you also say who you are so I know who I'm?
My name's Diane Laney Fitzpatrick, and my name tag says I'm a freelancer, but I'm really here as just a regular person. So my question for you is, what can we do as those of us who are not working journalists, what can we do to help fight fake news? Because I think I, like everybody else in this room, has that little group of friends from my hometown who post things on Facebook like Pizzagate and believe every conspiracy theory, and I don't really know how to engage with them or whether I should engage with them, because they're not going to, I'm not going to be able to leave here and convince them this is fake news and this isn't fake news. They're going to believe what they want to believe, and they're going to continue to post these kinds of things. So how can we, as non-journalists, deal with that?
I mean, I think that's part of the point of today's events writ large. I would say, you know, there's always a sign at the zoo, I'm sure there is at the Cleveland Zoo, that says don't feed the animals. And yet people come to see them, you know. So there's a question, you know, people will say in newsrooms, like if there are trolls going after you on Facebook or Twitter or Reddit, it doesn't behoove you to go after them. Kurt Eichenwald, in many ways a very talented journalist, seems incapable of resisting going after people who critique him, and some of them may be monstrous.
It never ends well.
And it just never, well, it not only does not end well, it doesn't end. And that's a bit of a problem. At the same time, you know, the Swift boat story was something that Democrats in 2004 didn't want to engage in, and journalists were like, this is on, you know, the second tier Rush Limbaugh's. We don't have to deal with this. This was June of 2004. By about August, it was baked into the core Republicans' belief that there was something real about this. And so the press's job is not to do John Kerry's handiwork for him, but it is to try to provide the best possible understanding of the truth and the facts and present them in a cogent way, in a way that's transparent enough that people understand how you got there, so that people can make their decisions as to whether or not this is how they assess things. And that was a failure in some ways of the press in that election, I'd say.
And in a way, we're not psychologists, right? Like coming up with the answer to that question is probably really requires like somebody in a human behavior expert. I can tell you that the one thing that I've heard most is that you're most successful when you're engaging in a face-to-face human relationship as opposed to a mediated relationship. So it might be that a social media platform is not the best place to, that's probably not where we're going to make a difference.
I mean, partly people can model their own their own aspirations. So you post things that you feel are from trusted sources. You double check on something that seems, oh my God, that confirms everything I've always thought about Hillary Clinton, or oh my gosh, I think that's everything I've always thought about Donald Trump. And you just make sure it's, you know, from a credible source, a credible outlet, shall we say, or figure or whatever, that is citing information, real people. And that you can, you know, as often as possible, you click hyperlinks to see where the original source is and whether or not that does it. But, you know, this is like weirdly graduate level citizenship. It's not, you know, when I was born, 3 anchors, you know, 4 national newspapers and the wire service dictating what it was. There's a full-on tsunami of information roaring at you. And so, you know, I think that you know, modeling certain responsibility in the aggregate, with any luck, becomes a thing. But you know, if you see somebody saying something and you can go to a PolitiFact or a Snopes or a Storyful or other places that are explaining not only the validity of something but how they got there, you know, you're at least doing it. And maybe somebody doesn't believe you in the moment, but they have that link to go back to. And I think that's something that we forget as journalists as well. People say, well, oh my God, you know, it is like whack-a-mole. It's not going to hold up, whatever. But now, at least if you put it there, they've got that to go back to, and they get in a less heated moment and say, okay, let me take a look at this. Let me see what's really going on here. And you move on. I don't think fake news is shifting 30% of our electorate, but I do think it affects the nature of the discourse playing out in front of it, and I think that's very, very problematic.
All right, another question.
Hi, I'm Aaron Rug. I'm a graduate student here in the PR program, and I'm just wondering if there's any sense among you and your colleagues that the more you fight against this fake news, the stronger it becomes, and if there are any alternate ways of thinking about maybe embracing it as having a strong effect on the culture, and ways we might be able to, I don't know, have a more accepting mindset about it to make our audience more aware of it, to understand it better, not just as journalists, but as our audience.
So forgive me, may I just clarify the question for a moment? When you say be more accepting, meaning being more accepting of people who are sharing it, or being more accepting of the material that's been shared?
Not accepting of the material that's being shared, but accepting of the fact that it's here, it's a part of all our culture.
Do you mean as opposed to lighting our hair on fire?
Right, so if we're fighting against this idea of fake news, as Trump presents it, for example, he has his base, and they're going to believe what he says. And if we fight against it, it makes that side feel stronger about what they believe. So
Right.
I'm wondering if you feel like there are any alternative thoughts to ways we can maybe educate our audiences more about what it's all about, where these sources are coming from, and have a more accepting, I guess, mindset about it to better
Right. So let me offer some thoughts on that and give a plug for the home team here, in a sense. Jim Acosta of CNN is in some ways a great example of that. He's really been combative with the president in certain ways. Not the first guy to be like that. You know, Sam Donaldson was famously like that during Reagan. Dan Rather during Nixon's stand-up, and Nixon sort of jokingly at a conference said, well, young man, are you running for president? And he said, no, sir, are you? And it was sort of an impertinent moment during Watergate, and reflected the humor but tensions on both sides. And Acosta has really taken great offense, understandably, at being the representative of CNN at major press conferences, nationally and internationally televised, at which the President of the United States, or the President-elect at certain moments, was just absolutely trashing CNN. I mean, the degree of incivility and the severity of the rhetoric is almost unprecedented for the modern, in modern American history, right? One of the things that NPR does, whatever its faults, NPR does really well is there are two qualities that I really love about it, for which I don't get any particular credit, but it's just the way the place is structured. You have people heard in their own voices, and I can't tell you how far that goes in people both listening and also the people being interviewed in building trust, because they're allowed to speak at some length, because there's the second element, civility is part of the DNA. And we're not a cable shout fest, and that is not what's expected of us. There are times where I admire the British broadcast interviewing cadence. There's an intensity to it, and my belief, validated by no one, is that it's because the head of government's not the head of state. They got the queen with the funny hats, and she's the head of state, so that's who you imbue all of your respect in. And in America, the head of state and the head of government's the same person. It's going to be George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump. And so there has to be a respect for the office. British prime ministers are not given the respect of office. They're politicians, and that's how they're treated. And I kind of love that because it allows for a degree of edge and a degree of an absence of utter deference. What NPR does really well, though, is the civility, the persistence, the best interviews. Terry Gross, Steve Inskeep, Audie Cornish, Robert Siegel. There's just a wonderful lineup of folks there. They're persistent, but they're civil, and they allow people to speak and say what's on their minds, and they allow people then to hear it at some length. And so you can interrogate the source, as it were. You can push back. You can be civil. Senator Cassidy has this bill up with Senator Graham about a health care bill, and I think NPR very respectfully and civilly, but forcefully unraveled a series of the claims that he was making on behalf of that bill. And people can believe us or not believe us, but at the same time we're presenting, we're doing our homework in public, in clear view, and we're presenting it without, snark. I'm allowed a little leeway, I'm allowed to use a little humor, I'm the media critic, they kind of let me do that, and there's some acknowledgement of that. But I'm not going to slam somebody simply for taking a position somebody else is criticizing, and we're not carrying the water for any party or any ideology. And I think that helps too.
All right, we've got time for one more question.
Oh,
Yeah, right there.
so much for going short on my part.
This gives me a chance to look backstage a little, As journalists, how do you feel with what I feel is almost a deliberate tearing down of journalism, inviting violence against our journalists? That one guy who was from the East Coast, West Coast, Oklahoma, that got slammed to the floor by a candidate, or Katie Kerr publicly. Spit it out, what do you mean? I don't remember any other administration being like this. What do you feel, as a journalist, is his true intent? If you have a thought. I don't expect a black and white answer, but if you have a thought.
You're asking about the president, I take it.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes, you are. I think, let's be very clear that the president, there's nobody who loves the media more than the president, as long as the media is paying attention and being laudatory of the president, okay? There's nobody who wants that more than Donald Trump, President of the United States. He wants to be on the Today Show. He wants to be on the cover of the New York Times Magazine. He wants the respect of all these places that he's attacking. He wants to be treated seriously.
So much so he's made fake magazine covers.
Oh yeah, the Time Magazine covers all over the Mar-a-Lago and other places, right? Mm-hmm. Like it's wrong to say that he hates the media. He is desperate for the media attention, and he's desperate for the media affirmation. And he wants to be, this is a very old school way of thinking about it, he wants to be asked to the prom. Like, that's all he wants. He wants to be asked to the prom, and he wants to bask in it. And when he doesn't get that, he gets angry. And you can tell, because he's got this state of mind machine called Twitter that just sort of plays out and unfurls in front of us. And not only does he say extraordinary things, he retweets extraordinary things, attacking the media, or making his case for him. He retweeted a guy the other day, I'm sure Greg talked about this, but it was a person, man or woman, whatever, whose handle included the phrase "fucked up." It wasn't quite spelt with a K. And forgive me for my almost language, but nonetheless, this is a first in presidential history, I assure you. And he's doing this because he wants the validation. He wants to undermine desperately the resolve of the press, and he also wants to ensure that his base, even if his level of support is somewhat eroding, sticks with him. And this is a very cost-free way for him to do that in that light. If he's attacking the press, that 22% or whatever of never-ending supporters will stick with him, because he's got somebody to, whatever's going wrong, to blame for it. So I think that's what he's doing. The problem is that's a minority, that is a sizable but minority slice of the population. It's not a way to govern. It's not a way to think about your relationship with the press, because the press will ultimately endure. But it is a problem for us now, even as our audiences are at record levels. The New York Times has a record level of paying subscribers. The Washington Post is getting crazy traffic. We're being lionized in movies instead of being trashed in them. This is a problem for us. It's also our challenge. And it is at once, I think, a political maneuver by the president, and yet truly revealing the mood ring of the occupant of the Oval Office.
It's actually a wonderful place to leave that. So thank you.
Thank you, guys. Thank you.